Next chapter, bullying. David felt bad about seeing his parents in this way. He knew they were physically older than him, and he knew that they had fed and clothed him, provided him with a home, and did in their own way love him. But he also understood that it was time to stop blindly obeying them. He knew he had to live his own life, and that meant he had to begin to allow his own knowing and to allow it to grow within himself, rather than just mimicking his parents' knowing or a teacher's knowing. It was time for him to assume primary responsibility for his own learning, his own growing, his own understanding and presence in the world. David understood from deep within himself that following his own path did not mean not loving his parents, but loving them and obeying whatever they said to him were two different things, and he was beginning now to clearly see the difference. In fact, he understood in a deep way that loving his parents meant being himself and trusting himself and pursuing his own growing and development, and that if he did this, he would grow to be the person he was truly meant to be, and that if he did this, then that was the only way to love his own parents as fully as he could. His parents did not really want a robot, an automaton, someone who blindly obeyed without thinking and knowing for himself. He knew things even though he didn't know how he knew them, and one of them was that each generation was supposed to grow into their own wholeness, and to do so was the only way to truly love one's parents and all who had initially loved and cared for him. As he walked to school, he was full of these thoughts, and then he suddenly felt Elephant's trunk gently resting on his shoulder. He realized suddenly that Elephant had been with him the whole time and had observed everything that had taken place this morning. He felt a spasm of joy deep within his body, and he let out a sigh as he put his own arm around Elephant's trunk, and they walked to school, trunk in arm. "I need your support now more than ever," David said, "and I'd love to hear what you see about all that is happening. You are my dearest friend, and I value your counsel." "As you just realized," Elephant answered, "I was there. I have been with you all along, and there are things that you do need to do on your own. This is how trust is developed." "But I don't think my parents would understand me at this point," David answered, "and I don't want to hurt them in any way." "Living your own life is not hurting your parents," Elephant replied, "unless they think you should be doing differently. And then the problem is not with you, but with their thinking. It's true that they have a different view of you than you have of yourself, but that's true for everyone. If their thoughts about you are different from who you are, that is just reality. Thoughts are different from being, in all cases, and they were not meant to be identical. You see, thinking is like a story that we tell, and that story changes as we grow, as we age, as we have new experiences and learn new things. We could even say that the story is always running, trying to catch up with our experiences, with our life, with our adventures. But it can only be fully present with us when it realizes if it is trying too hard to direct traffic, then it will only be in the way, because it is not the only way of knowing that we have. In fact, it is our newest way of knowing, and being new, it is still in many ways like a young child, trying to discover its own way, and sometimes very unwilling to ask for help. "But then maybe my own thinking is wrong," blurted David. "That's possible," answered Elephant, "but your thinking has me to help it, and I am much deeper and more ancient than thinking. If everyone were to seek the help of the animals that are alive inside themselves, then their thinking would not do such stupid things as it sometimes does." David was fascinated to hear this from Elephant, and he listened intently to what Elephant was telling him. "People get kind of stupid because they think that they are alive." "But aren't people alive?" asked David, puzzled. "People are alive, but not because they think. Their aliveness is much deeper than their thinking, and their aliveness can help their thinking to learn and to grow. But people have become kind of ignorant and stupid when they begin to think that they are only alive because they think. And then they try to shove thinking underneath aliveness and to make it responsible for directing their aliveness, rather than just trusting it as a fine storyteller, whose job is to tell the story of their adventures and to allow their aliveness to guide them through the world. But teachers tell us that we must go to school in order to learn how to think, David almost yelled at Elephant. Unfortunately, they're mistaken. You should be spending your time learning rather than thinking, for learning is much larger and deeper than thinking. And in order to learn, you do not need school, or at least not nearly so much of it as you're forced to sit through. And during much of the school day, you're not really learning, but just obeying, just doing whatever the teacher says and suffering the teacher's criticism if you don't obey, or else he sends you to someone above him who does the same. So the school day is filled to the brim with obedience and enduring criticism, but there's very little learning during that time. Teachers are, for the most part, big bullies. School is, for the greatest part, a waste of living, and it also distorts your relationship with older people, because they should be participating in helping you learn. A teacher's primary responsibility, if he or she is a true teacher, is to help you understand how you learn. But they must first of all know that themselves, and too many do not. Learning should be guided by respecting your own awareness and letting it guide you in your growing and learning. But the classroom has become more like a cage that interferes with your learning rather than supporting it. David was stunned to hear all of this. He felt shaken, and he realized he would never again see school in the same way. Next chapter, learning. I'm afraid I won't be able to do it, said David. Listen to yourself. If you start with fear, you will never get anywhere. If you start with the impulse to do it, then you start and you learn along the way, and it gets done. It may not look like the idea you had in the first place, but things will happen, and you will learn. Elephant was very adamant. And David heard him. David realized that one of his first reactions was fear, and Elephant had helped him understand that perhaps that was not the best starting point. Perhaps action was, whatever the action, and then at least there was movement. Whereas fear was a retraction from the world, and to pull back without first trying was not a good start. So with this understanding, David felt a surge of energy and a beautiful positive movement within himself. And he said to Elephant, "Okay, I will quit school." Take a minute to realize what you've just done. You've made a decision, and it is a positive movement, and you have begun. You may not know how, you may not know where or when, and you have not quit learning. In fact, your real learning is just beginning. But you have begun to stop being an obedient robot in a system that does not have your learning as its primary interest. And as you are a learner, if you love to do one thing, you love to learn. That is why you have been so fascinated observing your parents and finding the door to the dream that your father lived in. Without even knowing how you did it, you helped him open that door and walk through it. And you have me as a companion along your path. Elephant was delighted. David could see how delighted he was. And David also noticed that Elephant was lighter on his feet, bouncier, more elegant. Elegant as only an elephant can be. But David realized that he himself also felt lighter. He felt like a heavy weight had been lifted from his shoulders, and he was excited like he had never been in his life. He realized that school had become so routine and boring, so repetitive, that he had come to think of it with dread. He realized that it was the most dreadful part of his life. In fact, that his life now felt like an adventure, like something fresh and exciting, and his entire body felt refreshed and new. He would quit school. The decision had been made, and that was the first step, and now learning would begin. He felt like he would be learning with his whole body, not just his thinking and his words, and his body was excited. His body had a need to move, to run, to jump around, and not just to sit still at a desk for hours each day. That was not aliveness, but enforced obedience. Next chapter, leaving. That evening at home, David felt beautifully light. He moved easily. He was brilliantly aware. He seemed to see envelopes around each of his parents, several envelopes, as if each parent were encased in a series of membranes, and the membranes restricted and directed his parents' actions. Each parent carried some kind of energy cage around, and the cage seemed to act both as protection and as limitation. David realized that he himself had no cage, and so his actions and his thinking were much freer. But having no cage also allowed him to see the cages that his parents lived in. His parents, on the other hand, could not see their own cages, nor could they see that David had none. This blindness was part of their entrapment, and it also limited their intelligence and awareness. And David saw clearly why he had to not only quit school, but also to leave home. Leave home. He had not anticipated leaving home. Where would he go? What would he do? How would he live? He would miss his parents, and they would both miss him, and have strange thoughts about him, thoughts of being disliked, thoughts of bringing David back, even forcefully involving the police and officials. David recognized that this was the real challenge. Leaving school is minor compared to the act of leaving his parents, leaving home, going away. First, there was his responsibility to his parents, two people who had loved him, cared for him, and two people whom he had helped. He did not want them to hurt, yet he realized that they would. He also knew that there was no way they could understand his leaving, and that if he told them he was leaving, they would do everything they could in order to prevent it. He knew if he left secretly, they would search for him. If he left them a note or a letter, they would begin an immediate search, and may also think he had been kidnapped or influenced by someone. Could they not understand he had come to his own decision? And could they not trust him? No, they would think him too young, and they would feel themselves too responsible, and they would also fault themselves. David understood that these thoughts were part of the cages they both lived in, and that the cages would both prompt them to act and limit their understanding. That night, in his room alone, David told Elephant about his thoughts, his feelings, his concerns. "Yes," said Elephant, "this is a big step in your growing. Sorting out your responsibility to others from your responsibility to yourself. Recognizing how you depend on others and how they depend on you. And where does that dependence turn to control and blind obedience? And where does it lead to deepening and growing? Where does love come in, and where does love become demand? Can you love someone and still honor your need for the freedom to do your own growing and to become fully the person that you are? What is the relationship between loving and letting go?" David slept uneasily. He had a dream of sliding down a slippery embankment into a fast-flowing river that swept him away. The panic of drowning engulfed him. He couldn't see what was ahead. He could hear the roar of a waterfall and knew he was being swept toward it. He struggled initially, trying to swim against the current, but it was just too strong. He kept being swept under and didn't know if he would ever surface again. Gasping, he realized the waterfall was just ahead, and that the only sensible thing he could do was to allow the current to carry him and to trust the river. The waterfall was gentle, and he landed in a large pool. He just floated on the water and saw that he was surrounded by an awesome, peaceful forest. As he looked around, he saw numerous animals watching him from the banks of the pool. He felt a deep connection with them and understood they were his new family. Next chapter, Grandfather. The next morning, David arose early as usual now, prepared breakfast for his parents, greeted them when they arose, and then he hurried off to school. He was excited. He felt himself full of special energy, and he knew somehow that today would be a significant day, although he didn't yet understand how. He was shocked upon arriving at school to find a small man waiting for him. The man was old, well-tanned, with a straggly white beard and deeply penetrating eyes that seemed to see directly into David. David had never seen him before, but he felt that he knew him. Not only that, David felt that he had always known this old man. The old man greeted David by name. "I've been waiting for you. We need to go talk to the principal." David wasn't sure whether the old man had said this or whether David had only heard it. And David readily accompanied him as he headed directly for the principal's office. The old man knew his way around the school, although David was certain he had never been there before. Entering the office without knocking, David followed behind. The principal looked up immediately, and then his face flushed, and the principal stood up. David could not fully follow what was said. There was a bright light in the room, and the little old man seemed to be taller than David had initially realized. David did remember snatches of conversation, but it seemed to be disconnected, clearly and distinctly enunciated, and there was a penetrating power to it. It seemed to zing directly into the principal, who stood stupefied and just listened. Governor's Special Student Council. Only the best schools. Average but distinguished students. Instructed to inform the parents with the governor's respectful request. These were some of the snatches of sentences that David remembered hearing. Then the old man motioned to David that they were to leave, and they walked out of the principal's office, out of the school, and they both got into a small gray Volkswagen. David noticed that it had British Columbia license plates. All of this had happened so quickly that David had not even had time to ask any questions. The old man turned to David and said, "You can call me grandfather. You need to write a letter to your parents. Don't say too much, but let them know that you are fine and that you will write to them again later. When we pass through the capital, you can mail it." David was so full of questions that he didn't even know where to begin. So he wrote the letter. The envelope was already addressed, and the stationery looked very official, and the letterhead said, "From the office of the governor." David's thinking was totally confused, thoughts bumping into one another, whirring around, trying to make sense. But even though his thinking could find no direction, David felt his presence with the old man was like a bright, warm light. Suddenly David remembered, "I can ask my elephant." Elephant was present with a smile on his face. He just looked at David and said, "You are on your way." Next chapter, the journey. They stopped in the capital, and David put the letter in a mailbox. The envelope was already stamped. He got back in the Volkswagen and was finally settled enough to begin to ask questions. "Who are you, and how did you manage to appear at just the right time? I don't understand what happened in the principal's office. How did you come to have the governor's stationery with you, already addressed to my parents? And where are we going?" So many questions, answered the old man. "As I said, you can call me grandfather. We heard your call in the village, and I decided to come get you in order to save you time and to help you learn as we travel back." "But I didn't call any village. What village are you talking about? How do you know me?" "So many questions," answered grandfather. "The world is not the way you have learned to think about it. That is just your thinking, and thinking has its limitations. So don't confuse your thinking with reality. It's not the same thing. Thinking is just a possible story that we tell each other. And as you see, your thinking does not at all fit with what you have experienced this morning. So let your experience be bigger than your thinking. And don't try to make experience fit into what you already think. Thinking is usually a bit behind. Unfortunately, there are cultures that think that thinking needs to be deliberately constructed in each child so that all thinking is approximately the same. But this destroys the natural, unique aliveness of each child, and they become like robots ready to make sounds on demand, and all the sounds have to fit one another, and the entire exciting unknown future is then laid out like a train on tracks. What's the excitement in that? We knew that you were at a unique place in your path, and that if you were not rescued, you would be robotized like all the rest. So everything came together at the right time. I come from a culture that has not disconnected itself from the aliveness of the world. We don't want to control everything like some cultures do, but we are available for special circumstances when there is specific opportunity, as there was now with you. But you kidnapped me. Don't be silly. You came along willingly. You've actually been rescued from the prison of the mind where your culture wanted to confine you. The prison of the mind? Yes, aliveness is bigger than the mind. Wholeness is larger than the mind. And that is where you belong, not in the frozen repetitiveness of belief systems. We should never try to enslave one another, nor ourselves. Unfortunately, your schools do exactly that. But what did you tell my principal? And what was that bright light in his office? And why did he say nothing? Oh, your principal is such a minor functionary. He's a cog in a system that is frozen. All I needed to do was push a few buttons in his thinking, and he filled in the blanks. He was totally confused and was struggling to hold his thinking together so it would make sense in the way it always had to him. A bit of flattery and he was hooked. But you lied to him. No, he lied to himself. In fact, he's been doing that for most of his life. And that is not the kind of a person that needs to be running a school. A school, if one needs to exist at all, should help people discover the deepest, most beautiful and creative aspects of their own aliveness, and to respect the uniqueness in the world rather than trying to fit everything into common molds. Your school was doing the exact opposite of what a school should be. With each answer, David felt his own thinking stretch, and he felt good and knew he was in the right place. Even though he had just met Grandfather, he felt a deep trust in him, and he knew Grandfather was a true teacher, the kind he had always longed for. When they were nearing the border of the United States, Grandfather deviated from the highway, took a road that led through the mountains, eventually seeming to be not more than a trail. And topping the mountain, David could see that ahead there were vast forests and endless mountains, and he felt that he had come home. Next chapter, Arriving. It was after dark when David and Grandfather arrived at the village. They had been driving all day and possibly much of the night. David had fallen asleep soon after the border was crossed and didn't know how long he had been sleeping. They had been traveling along a dirt road, and David had seen tall trees on both sides of the road, thickly forested, dark, and there was no moon to be seen. Although he had eaten nothing since breakfast, David was not in the least hungry, perhaps because he was so excited. They had not entered the village very far when Grandfather pulled the Volkswagen up next to a large wooden building and parked. They both got out and went inside. David noticed that the doorway was oval-shaped with heavy blankets shielding out the cold. Grandfather led David to a small alcove that was lined with furs and pelts and indicated to David that he should sleep on a small mattress that lay to one side of the room. Snuggling under a cozy blanket, David experienced a warm contentment, a sense of being deeply at home in the beginning of a great adventure, and was soon fast asleep. Next chapter, Awakening. David was deep asleep when he felt a hand on his shoulder. Opening one eye sleepily, he saw it was Grandfather, shaking him to wake him up, and he emerged from the warm, sleepy place where he had just been. "Time to get up," Grandfather said. "The sun is just rising, and we always wake up when the sun does." He led David outside to a small stream and told him to splash some water on himself. It was cold and brisk. Grandfather told him he could go behind some trees if he needed to pee, which he did, and then they went back inside the large house. They sat on the floor, and Grandfather gave David a piece of cold, dried salmon and a cup of some warm drink. It seemed to be some kind of brewed herb, and David ate and drank greedily. Grandfather looked at him and smiled. "Why do we have to get up so early?" David asked. "It's not early," replied Grandfather. "The day is waking up, and we're a part of the day, so we should wake up too. In fact, today is the day you will begin waking up." This sounded strange to David. He was already awake. How could he begin doing what he was already doing? Grandfather saw his consternation and just smiled, seeming to know something David didn't. "You will spend the day with Bear Man," said Grandfather. "He will help you begin waking up." Again, David felt some consternation and thought perhaps Grandfather was playing games with words. Just then a large man entered the house. He filled the doorway as he entered and came directly toward Grandfather and David. "So, this is our young man. Yes, he needs to be filled up and emptied out," Bearman said mysteriously. He was wearing a large bear skin, and there was something bear-like about him. His presence seemed to fill the entire house, and he laughed and talked freely, and there was a dusky smell about him, something animal-like. David liked him, and also sensed something unpredictable and dangerous about him. Bearman was abrupt and big, both in his speech and in his actions, but he was also warm, and he seemed to touch David in some way, even from a distance. He put his hand warmly on David's shoulder and said, "Finish filling your belly, and then we'll go fill out your skin." David felt there was something being said that he didn't understand, and he saw the crinkling at the corner of Grandfather's eyes. He stood up and followed Bearman out of the large house. Glancing back at Grandfather, he noticed a warm and caring smile on Grandfather's face. Bearman quickly walked up a trail toward the thickly forested hillside, and David followed hurriedly. Although he didn't know where they were going or what they were going to do, he realized that he trusted Bearman. He had never before met anyone so full of energy. After a short while, they arrived at a small clearing, and Bearman said suddenly, "We can leave our clothes here." Before David could ask a question, Bearman had taken off his bear skin and his moccasins and was standing naked before him. David was stunned and a bit embarrassed and said, "But I don't understand why we need to take our clothes off." "You've been insulated all your life," Bearman replied. "You have always been covered with something. How can your skin feel its aliveness if you insist on making it blind? Our first task today is to help your skin begin to wake up. It's been asleep your whole life, and understanding won't wake it up. Only waking up will wake it up." David was startled to hear this. He'd never thought of his skin as being blind. What did that mean? And how can skin wake up? Before he could say a word, Bearman had already started along another path that led deep into the forest. So without thinking, David took his clothes off and shoes and hurried behind Bearman in order not to be left behind. As he hurried along, he felt a freedom and an elation that he had not felt before. There was a brisk breeze on his whole body, but he also felt vulnerable and exposed. What if they met someone along the way? he would have nothing to cover himself with. As he tried to keep up with Bearman, he realized that his entire thinking was focused on covering himself up in some way, as if that were the most important thing in the world. And he realized that what he feared most was meeting someone else while he was naked. Bearman was walking at a very brisk pace, forging his way higher and higher up the steep trail, and David had to hurry to keep from losing sight of him. Out of breath, he finally arrived at a small stream, at a place where it widened out to form a basin. Bearman was splashing around in the basin, tossing water around, carrying it in his hands up to his face, slapping his own skin, breathing deeply and vigorously. He seemed to be laughing and growling at the same time. He called out to David, arriving out of breath, "Come on in, what a great way to begin to wake up." Without thinking, David plunged into the stream and was startled at how brisk the water was. He felt himself retract automatically and tried to pull back out, but Bearman said, "Come on in, put your head under the water. Slap your skin like I do. Help it begin to wake up. It has been asleep way too long, and it can't enjoy itself while it's asleep." David began slapping his own skin and felt the warmth of the slap mixed with the cold of the water. It was invigorating, an experience David had never had before now. Bearman came over and slapped David on the back several times with his big hands, in places he himself could not reach. His entire skin began to tingle and shiver. "There," said Bearman, "now your skin is waking up. See it shaking off the sleep? It's been asleep for many years. Poor skin. How could you treat it like that? Don't you know it's an important part of your own aliveness? If your skin is asleep, you can't be fully alive." David did feel more alert and aware than he had ever felt before, and he also felt that he didn't quite know how to handle being naked. His nakedness was something he had always learned to shield from other people. Somehow they were never supposed to see his body, yet his body felt good, very good, and miraculously refreshed. Better now than any shower he had ever had. Bearman crawled out of the basin and stood in the sunshine, standing openly naked. "Look at my hairy dick and balls," he said. David was startled. He had never before had anyone call attention to their sexuality, and he spontaneously covered his own penis and testicles with his hands. "It looks like you're starting to grow some hair too," said Bearman. "Good. That means you've entered the passageway from being a boy to being a man. It's one of the most important passageways you will ever travel through in your life. So it's good to be fully aware of it. And if you're not fully awake, you can't get all the way through it. Many men are stuck halfway through the passageway, still acting like boys when they should be acting like men. But come on, your skin still needs to learn again how to see. It has been sadly put to sleep for most of your life." With this, Bearman took up his brisk pace up the mountain, and David followed. David felt the breeze on his naked body as it dried, and the soft touch of branches and leaves as he traveled through the undergrowth. And he realized that his body enjoyed being in touch with the surroundings, and he felt much more present in his own body. The fast pace continued for what seemed to David like hours, and he was out of breath and panting, but Bearman kept on moving at the same pace, occasionally stopping to look around and sniffing the air. Then Bearman suddenly came to a brisk halt and signaled to David to not make a sound. Bearman crouched down on the ground and motioned for David to approach him quietly. David crouched right in front of him, and Bearman said in a whisper, "Look directly behind me and tell me what you see." David glanced up and focused his eyes on the dark forest at a short distance behind Bearman, then involuntarily pulled back and almost ran. Bearman kept his eyes keenly on David. "There's a bear in the forest right behind you," whispered David. "Good," said Bear Man. "I can see him with my back, so keep looking at him and let yourself be fully aware of what you feel." David thought this a strange request. Of course he felt tremendous fear. What else should he feel? David felt himself shudder and shiver with fear. But then it diminished a bit, and he realized that the bear was looking directly at them both, but was not moving. The bear was looking at them just as David was looking at the bear. And Bear Man said something very strange. "What is the bear feeling?" The question startled David. How could he know what a bear felt? As he struggled with this question, he became aware that the bear was very curious about them and interested in why the two of them were there. "Good," said Bear Man out of the blue. And David realized that Bear Man was observing him closely and commenting on what David had realized about the bear. Bear Man seemed to be looking into David rather than at him. And David felt a shudder run through his body as he recognized that his body had seen the same thing. David was being observed not only for what he was doing and saying, but for what he was thinking and feeling. He had not realized this was even possible. And he also realized that this was exactly what Bear Man was asking David to do with the bear. Suddenly the bear turned and silently walked away. And David knew that the bear understood they were no threat to it. "Good," said Bear Man. "You are beginning to wake up."